Hello, and welcome to my dissertation presentation. The title that I have chosen to use for my dissertation is Audience Expectations and Relationships Within Horror. During this presentation, I'm going to talk about my aims and the films that I'm going to use to show that movie makers adapt their films in line with the ever-changing social climate. The reason I have chose this topic is because I have a fascination with the horror genre and how what we link with horror has changed throughout the ages, going from the 70s with films such as The Exorcist, a film which preyed on social fears of devils and demons, a fear that was instilled in people at the time that it was released. I'll be using the 70s as a jumping off point to talk about the decades and what made them scary for the time, and how this represents the fears of society. I am going to talk about how I plan to compare and contrast 4 horror films from different decades. Films which, in my opinion, represents the social climates of the decade. During this presentation, I will also be talking to you about how I plan to use my timings and how I plan to critically review the dissertation once it's done. Once I have finished my presentation, I would be grateful for any feedback which will help me refine and improve my dissertation. Have you ever watched a really old horror film and thought, why was it so scary, even though at the time it would be classed as shocking? For example, the 1970s film The Exorcist, where Linda Blair's character swirls her head all the way around and projectile vomits everywhere. At the time, this was deemed as controversial, but watching it today, it seems quite tame, especially when you watch the more recent Jigsaw, which is full of mutilation and the audience thirst for blood. And yet, current horror films are actually slowly moving away from blood to sort of go into a different level of horror, psychological horror. This is why I decided I need to look at how horror has evolved over time, and the reason behind these shifts. Is it simply the fact that technology has improved, or has it been fueled by something else? The needs and expectations of the audience. So, my aims are to show how audience expectations influence the journey of horror films, moving it on, fulfilling expectations of the time. These films of horror and what we have come to expect from them has changed drastically since the 70s, where films such as The Exorcist and The Omen were at the height of popularity. These films were made at a time where 65% of Americans were said to be Christian. In any film that went against the belief of God and showed demons and devils were deemed as controversial. Now, it is estimated that only 17% of Americans are Christian, resulting in the fact that we have less films about gods and demons, but more on social media, such as Follow Me and Unfriended. That shows a more modern take on horror that is more relatable for this day and age. Audience do not want to part with their hard-earned money to watch a film that's not going to make them feel scared or achieve an adrenaline rush. Alongside the films that I'm going to compare and contrast, I'm also going to focus on 2 directors, whose films have spanned over several decades, thus highlighting significant changes. How have their creativity been influenced by society? The first one, Wes Craven, directed The Hills Have Eyes, that was released in 1977. The film's about a group of cannibals in the arid Southwest California desert who are chasing down a group of deserted vacationers. This is one of the first campers in peril films, and when it came out, it was quite shocking that this type of thing could happen. And the fact that Wes Craven claimed that it was based on a true story would have made it more terrifying at the time. The other one, Nightmare on Elm Street, is a 1984 horror film that caused waves at the time it was released, being that it's a story where people are dying in their sleep from fear, still with no actual explanation how they died. This was based on another story about people dying in their sleeps that doctors claim was stress-related. But instead of using the stress-related bit, he just made it a bit more supernatural. The other director I'm going to look at is John Carpenter. He made Halloween in 1978. That is a slasher classic, though isn't the first slasher film, that being Bay of Blood, but is probably the most iconic, or second iconic, due to John Carpenter's inspiration from his psychology classes where he visited mental institutions. Because of this gave Halloween a very realistic feel that could make it believable that it could happen in any neighbourhood. This is why it resonated with people more. The other one he made was The Thing, that was released in 1982. Inspired by the 1938 book Who Goes There by John W. Campbell Jr., this film brings up old fears of the 50s while combining them with fears of the 80s. It shows the paranoia of the 50s as communist invaders coming to destroy our way of life was a big concern at the time. This is seen all over the film, as like in Halloween, anyone could be the monster or communist spy, making everyone mistrust each other as anyone could be the monster. But this is also not the only thing the Thing represents. It also links to the AIDS epidemic of the 80s, being that, like with AIDS, there's no way you can tell someone is the Thing without doing the blood test, saying if they're positive or not. This is mimicked through the film as eventually they do use blood tests to find out who's the alien, and this would have stoked the fear of AIDS at the time the film was released. Wes Craven and John Carpenter are notably influential directors of the horror genre. I will show that they are prime examples of how directors are influenced by audience participation, but I want to give a more in-depth conclusion by looking at a wider range of films, providing evidence that this phenomena is not just related to these two filmmakers. One of the films that I will be looking at is The Exorcist, being that I think it's a good example of using fear of the 70s to scare people to the point where they fainted while in the cinema. Another film I will be looking at is Friday the 13th, being that I think it's a good 80s film that represents the fear of the time, being that it shows shows teens dying of having sex before marriage and using drugs to show that if you do these things, it will lead to you dying. A more modern film I'm going to look at from the 90s will be The Blair Witch Project, being that it used interesting marketing techniques, being that it claimed to be real footage, and cementing this by putting up missing person posters everywhere, and using the internet at the time that was only just emerging to make a website that looked like it was made by the students, and spreading the rumour of the Blair Witch around AOL chat rooms and message boards, creating more intrigue for the film. And finally, the fourth film I will be looking at is Get Out. It was released in 2017, and it talks about the race issues in America that still linger in some communities, and this is seen throughout the film. We can see this with how they portray the police laughing at our main protagonist, being that he is black, and that it is more or less black people missing people cases that often go more unsolved. But films will not be my only source of information while doing this dissertation. I will also be looking at a few books, both of which look at horror through the ages. First of all, I will be looking at The Monster Show. This book goes through horror and what made people scared from the early 90s all the way to the 1980s. Throughout the book, it talks about the current climate around the films that were being released, such as Freak Show in 1932, and how in the 30s people were fascinated and scared by anything different than what was seen around them. This is why freak shows at the circus were actually popular at the time. The second book I'll be looking at is Monster Theory, released in 1996. This talks about monsters, demons, and fiends, and how they can be used to express the unease of the times, and in some cases create new fears within the societies. It also talks about how it's due to our fascination with monsters that makes us want to look at what's different and explore it. I plan to document my findings by writing this dissertation. I plan to write about 250 to 500 words a day. This should give me 10 to 20 days of writing, which allows me to take days off to focus on other things other than writing this dissertation, such as the other units that are integral to my course. I believe that giving myself a word count will be more beneficial to me, being that it is a clearer goal day to day instead of just setting out to write and just get it done. However, I do realise that some days the word count may change, particularly if I'm partway through an important section. I'd like to finish that, so it just gives me less work to do other days. This way it gives me a more clear understanding on how many days it would take to write this essay, so that I don't cut it close with the deadline, enabling me to proofread and edit. After the 10 to 20 days of writing, I will start with the reviewing and editing process. This is an important part of the creative stage, and I believe that this will be the longest bit for me, being that I will have to send it off to be reviewed and redone several times before I am happy to submit it. Finally, the way that I'm going to review the dissertation is by doing a few things. Firstly, I will compare and contrast with other essays of the similar theme and nature. It will allow me to see what others have done the same and differently with regards to the topics I talk about in my piece. The other way is that I will be giving it to like-minded people, or like myself, to see their opinion on what is being talked about. This way I will be more able to get a more accurate and quicker feedback on the dissertation itself. With all that said, I will now be answering any questions you have in regards to my dissertation or anything else that you want more answers on. Thank you for listening.